Hey, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Reed Ipser. I'm the Technical Director for Nisus Corporation. I'm here to talk about small flies, particularly small fly control in commercial kitchens. Start with a video. All right, so that's probably a common occurrence that everybody witnesses in a lot of restaurants. That was actually a dark-eyed fruit fly. It's a pretty big one. And sometimes size matters with regards to their health and the amount of time they've actually been in a particular facility. All right, so when I would say majority of my technical calls are probably small flies ranks about second to third for me. And every time I travel and work with pest operators in commercial kitchens, I always ask the manager, how often do you clean your soda lines? And many responses like, oh, we clean them all the time. We don't, every week, every month. Well, a lot of times that's not true. And what happens is as a soda line will get clogged, and this is what results from this clogging. This is the cause of the clogging. This is what you call a sugar snake. Now, these sugar snakes look like something out of an alien film. But what it is just condensed corn syrup, fructose high corn syrup, whatever it might be. And this can happen not only in soda lines, but actually like in clubs, not just like Coca-Cola and Sprite, but club soda as well, things of that nature. And even like water lines can get kind of nasty too, and so they should be cleaning them regularly, okay? As you can see right here, this is a close-up, and you also notice how I'm wearing protective equipment. It's very important, I think, when you're working commercial kitchens. Another question, the second question I asked usually particularly for larger businesses is that if you have a customer service rep, someone that actually answers calls and that's what their main performance goal is, their main job is in the company, that you take one of them out to a particular pest issue. That is that have them see the restaurant that it has an issue, because if they get to understand that environment, then they'll be able to predict and help the potential technician who's going to service that establishment prior to them actually being there. That is that they can be able to ask better questions to the potential customer, and then helps you, the operator, kind of build the baseline and sort of predict what the issue is going to be, okay? So for a particular sales fly program, and fly sales program, you just want to understand the budget of your customer. That is that you can definitely underprice it if you're not careful. And by doing this, you need to give realistic expectations in terms of what do they expect from you and what you can give them in return, okay? Some places are pretty much unfixable until they actually, in of themselves, adopt a sanitation program that allows you, the operator, to actually do your job better, okay, and actually conduct pest control, because sometimes there's so much mess and debris that really you might even be violating a label if you have a lot of foodstuffs and materials that are sitting around. So that's something you have to be careful about. And also that you can also price it to where, and explain to the potential customer that you can forecast future savings by upfront cost. That is that you might have an upfront cost, but down the road, it will even out, and then before you start the very beginning high, and then you sort of lower it as you get to the maintenance cycle of the facility, okay? So you could be the hero. You can be the hero by, if you fix the issue, you're the hero. Now, if you fail in some respect, and whether it's lack of preparation or other variables into play, then of course that can come back and bite you. But without a doubt, you can be the hero, particularly if it's a potential account that has had other operators or other problems that haven't been fixed, and you go and fix those issues, you'll become the hero, all right? So when I usually talk about IPM, it's a multitude of tactics to control a pest population. That is that you have this inspection, you identify, you can control, and you monitor. But you're solving a problem overall. What you are doing is you're solving an issue, whether it's and though you're focusing on the insect pest itself, it's peace of mind. You're giving your customer peace of mind, okay? So think of IPM as that way as well, and that you're solving a problem. You know, all these things come down to the fact that you're solving an issue, and you're the professional, and that's what you're hired to do. Now, what determines the price of service? So this is something that I get asked quite a bit, you know, and I really don't like to get into pricing because every situation is different, depending if you're working with a franchise, it could be a franchise company to a mom and pop operation. It all sort of, there's variations on the theme. It's very hard for me to say, hey, this is how you should price something, but I can tell you that usually it's the amount of work you're going to put into that. Historically, chemical cost is around maybe less than 6%. So it's about the actual elbow grease that you have to involve yourself in to make that price of that service. That being said, this is what sort of involves a proper, say, pest management control program. And if you look at all these variables into play, all these bullet points, this is something that you can kind of give to the customer and say, hey, this is what's going to take for me to help solve your issue. And so when they see what exactly you need to do, what the process is, then they'll probably be more apt to accept your initial price point, okay? But it's about mechanical control as well, and proper application, exclusion, things of that nature, cleaning, all that comes into play that you can give to your customer, tell them this is exactly what you're going to do. All right, so you think about the IPM approach, inspecting and so forth, then you have the control methods. Now, then the communication education as well. You follow up and re-inspect. So if you think about that, what happens if you come to an account that's in serious need of service? You might have to be there every day or every other day for the first week or 2 weeks. And then maybe it's every other week, then it's every month. And I could tell you, usually in a kitchen, you're probably going to go about every month to where you're maintaining something, all right, where the pest population's decreased enough to where you can do a maintenance service every month to keep it below a certain injury level, so to speak. It's an investigation, so you're sort of like a detective with regards to what you're trying to solve. The identification of the species, the actual sanitation level, and then the level of exclusion. That is that you're going to try to do some sort of exclusion work, most likely. What is that going to take? Are there already certain variables in place that will help you do that, or do you have to start from the ground up? And then what are the breeding sites? I can tell you right now that it's different with flies and most other pest insects, is because you have the larvae that reside in one area and the adults reside in another area. So when you're trying to discover breeding sites, that can take a lot of time and effort. Okay, so it goes back to the investigation process, and then you want to document. I think at best to document the best way possible. That is, whether it's graphs, written notes, things of that nature, so you leave a good track record and history of that particular account. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you identify the right species. That is, that if you think something is a drain fly and it's actually a dark-eyed fruit fly, or a forward fly for that matter, you're probably going to miss the mark and potentially lose the account. All right, definitely have a lot of callbacks, and I would say you probably exude a lot of energy to trying to solve an issue that you think is worse than it really is, or not as bad as it really is, or vice versa. That is, that if you get the wrong species, then your program is going to be kind of off the beaten path and it won't work. Something like, for example, something like this. So this right here, this particular picture, these are domestic beetles, all right? Now, they don't really look like fly larvae, but to some untrained eye, they might. And so if they have potential food beetles and you can ID it as a fly, you're going to miss the mark, and vice versa, okay? Here's another great example, whereby you have a syrphid fly, okay? This is not necessarily a pest species. If something like this comes in the restaurant, it's most likely by accident. These are pollinators. But if you start saying this is a blowfly or this is a drain fly, then you're going to miss the mark, okay? So make sure you get the species correct. Now, as far as identification and classification, so just to kind of touch on the biology of flies, They're holometabolists, right? So they go from egg, larva, pupa, adult. And Diptera are it's a very large order, one of the largest orders of insects. And there's a lot of variations in the theme in terms of what flies actually, where they actually live and how they survive. Some are parasitic at larva stage, some are not. And some of the adults are just pollinators, some of course are bloodsuckers and disease carriers. With regards to small flies in commercial kitchens, generally the lower level ones are not disease carriers, but as you get into the blowflies and the flesh flies and of course the housefly, occasional housefly, that can become a problem, okay? So the larvae though usually live in wet environments, and that's why you'll find a lot of the pest spaces in the drains and areas that are really damp and moist, but then the adults sort of congregate where the food is. So there's two separate areas, and that's what makes sometimes fly control commercial kitchens quite difficult. All right, so what does it say? This says there's a variation on the theme and that they're very adaptable to all sorts of environments, okay? They can be capable of anything, as I say. Don't be fooled when it comes to flies, particularly some of the more aggressive like for example, the housefly and the flesh flies, because they will adapt to just about any environment, and I'll tell a story a little bit later with that regard. So here's a picture. Now, you have larva at the left, pupa in the center, and adult at the right, okay? And you can go on extension websites and so forth like that and look at different fly larvae, and see what they look like. They generally, larvae have that term maggot, because maggot just, to me, exudes like disgustingness, right? They don't look nice and juicy like a beetle larva. They look kind of gross, and they move really, really sort of disgustingly. So that once your eye is trained on what a fly maggot looks like, you probably won't misidentify it. Starting with the common flies in food facilities, I like to call it the 4 stages. That is that as you start with stage 1 or DEFCON 1, and you move up, usually the ones in the lower stage can be included within the pest problem, okay? So as you get worse, then you can assume that the lesser problematic flies are also included in that overall umbrella of issues. So we'll start with the drain fly. Now, drain flies moth flies are somewhat free living. They sort of naturally occur in swampy areas anyhow, and they're probably the first to sort of draft into a structure, whether it's a homeowner account or a commercial kitchen, or whether it's a restaurant or a kitchen in a hotel or something like that, a boat, whatever it might be. They sort of fly. They're weak flyers, and they tend to stay the same areas, and you can see how their wings are sort of like very hairy. Now, the life cycle. This is interesting. The life cycle I have up here, 7 to 28 days. I think in the very warm and moist environments where it's real hot all the time, you could probably get up as low as 7 to 10 days. Colder environments, 28 days. That is if you're if they're in a bar area, it's outside during the wintertime, that it's heated with, say, heat lamps, so the variation in temperature changes greatly. You're probably going to have a larger life cycle with this group. Okay, the weak flyers, that is, they usually congregate and stay in one area. So as you disturb a trash can or a drain, they'll sort of fly up and kind of mingle in the air and come back down, all right? This is DEFCON 1. You can hammer these real quick, be the hero, go home, watch your favorite sports channel, and feel great about yourself. They don't spread disease, which is good, okay? So these are just kind of a nuisance fly, so to speak, and fairly easy to kill once you identify their source. DEFCON 2 is the red-eyed fruit fly. Now this is the light red-eyed fruit fly, where now you're getting into a more problematic environment where you have issues with like fermenting juices and so forth. When I say fruits, not necessarily just oranges and apples. It can be lemons, it can be tomatoes, it can be anything that is a true fruit, okay? So even avocados, red-eye fruit flies like quite a bit. Stuff that kind of breaks down and gets moist and will sort of liquefy. Onions, potatoes even. So they're more on the basic side of more the carbohydrate side of things, okay? And their life cycle is very short, and this is partially due to biological research with genetic marking and so forth. But after about 10 days, you're going to get a next generation regardless of where you are for the most part, where the problem is located, not only in the restaurant itself, but where the restaurant's located. They, as I said, they're like fermenting fruits and that nature, and they're attracted to light. So this is more of a situation where this group will sort of beeline to something that's bright. So if you're working at night, obviously the restaurants are open at night, and you open the door, leave the door open, and they happen to be at a dumpster somewhere else, they'll be attracted to that wavelength and go in with decision making. So they'll go in, they'll sort of enter in a way that is a concerted effort instead of a drain fly that might just waft in through air currents and so forth. Okay. Another thing too is that mop water and all that stuff is potential breeding grounds for them. And if you don't clean your mop heads and things of that nature, you can potentially spread them around the restaurant, and then they can move into other areas. And these also will sort of congregate in particular sometimes not just the kitchen areas, but also storage areas as well. Okay, where you're storing the food, not say processing the food. Now, the dark-eyed fruit fly is at stage 3. This gets a little bit more complicated because now you're talking about not just the fruits and decaying matter with regards to carbohydrates, but you're adding the protein source. This fly does like meats in some way, but they also get attracted to a larger variety of carbohydrate sources. That is like the alcohols, the beers, I've seen this fly actually in the distillery areas of bourbon barns, where they're attracted to the sort of the sugars what the alcohols leave behind, right? So you might have an unclean table that has a lot of residual alcohol on it, and the alcohol evaporates, the sugars are left there, and the fly kind of eats that. Recall the video that I showed earlier, and they'll consume those sort of surface sugars. Okay, they like bar wells, they like beer taps. They'll actually go into they'll crawl into sometimes uncovered beer taps if the tap hasn't been cleaned properly. So they're the DEFCON 3, and then you have the stage 4, which is the forward fly. Now, the forward fly is a little bit unique because a lot of times it's associated with not just unsanitary conditions based on leftover food and uncovered food and that nature, but now you're getting to like really potential like organic decaying matter that's maybe associated with broken pipes and so forth. That is that they'll come across, they can be found in sewer lines and things of that nature. In fact, there was a restaurant in New York City that had a forward fly problem in their display case with food, and I had talked to our sales associate in that area, and I said, there's probably a broken sewer line of some sort, and sure enough, that company they didn't waste any time. They shut down, dug into the floor, and found out there was a cracked sewer line. So these flies are coming in from the sewer line, all that gunk and organic debris and feces, whatever it is, the sewage debris, and then coming into the restaurant area, the dining area, and then actually going into display cases. And they'll be drawn into lights as well. Flies generally like lights overall. They're attracted to lights in general. The forwards, their life cycle is around 2.5 weeks or so, but they're really one of the more difficult species to eliminate because of the diversity of breeding sites. That being said, as I mentioned earlier, if it is something where you have a problem with a sewer line, then usually once you fix that physical barrier, so to speak, when you fix that physicalness of whatever that is, then it usually they disappear. Okay, but they're humpback flies, they call them, and the forwards that we work with are a small group. I mean, there's a lot of forward flies. Some are parasitic, some are free living. Not all of them are restaurant dwellers, but they have this sort of humpback with a really knobby head. Okay. All right, so you see his picture right here. And of course I took the picture and try to notice how the distance is to the bar. This is in a hotel restaurant. The bar is probably maybe 35, 40 feet. And lo and behold, I have a fly in my drink. Now, I've always thought that, and I still believe that as the farther you're away from a particular source and you get flies, that means that as you get closer to the source, there's more flies. So it's kind of related to the fact that you have a greater issue the farther you're away, and you still get flies in your food or in your drinks. Okay, so keep that as a sort of a baseline in terms of if you're trying to determine how to bring your price point to the potential customer. Now, the housefly. The housefly is of course a disease-carrying fly. It's probably the #1 fly pest urban-wise, and in some ways agricultural as well. It is, I would say, a large breeding fly. Musca domestica has evolved to live with humans, and it has the sponging mouth parts. That is that you can land on some feces, and then it will sponge and all that stuff up and land on your pizza and spit it out and sponge, and then you don't know that, and you go eat the pizza and you might get sick. All right. But think about, look how many eggs it lays per cluster, around 300 and 900 eggs I would say in a lifetime, but a 75 to 50 in a cluster. So that's a lot of eggs. And the life cycle is around 2 weeks, maybe a little bit longer. As I say right here, they carry about 100 disease pathogens. This fly is probably the #1 adaptable fly with regards to all sorts of environments. My story that I have to tell you, when I was in grad school, I lived next to a sort of an agricultural field, and I had this, and occasionally I'd get a housefly that come to my house and I'd kill it, but one day, and after I kill one, there wouldn't be one that would come in for another week or two, but there was one weekend that I would kill one, and all of a sudden another one, a couple hours is around, and another one's around. I was like, what's going on here? So I had a pet dog, and I didn't really live messy. I didn't have much to buy, so it was not much mess to make. But I'm like, you know what? My dog's water bowl was actually on a towel on a vinyl floor. I'm like, maybe they're coming from there. And lo and behold, open up the towel, and there's maggots everywhere. So you think about that a female fly laid a bunch of eggs underneath a towel on a vinyl floor, and those maggots were somehow surviving and pupating somewhere else and becoming adults. So that's how adaptable this species is, okay? I'd also like to mention the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee. This is a great organization to reference with regards to pest problems and future reading. It gives you a baseline in terms of how to prolong your effectiveness. It is that IRAC is there to help insecticides work better. You as an operator to use the material in such a way where you prolong the effectiveness and you reduce the resistance of the insecticide itself. And I always say that resistance to us is callbacks, right? Resistance is a misapplication, something didn't work, you're called back, you lose out a slight bit of revenue. That's what resistance is to our urban industry. You can order this particular poster. It shows all the different families based on modes of action of the insecticides. Right here are the pyrazoles. Okay, well, this is where fipronil is located. And then you have the borates, our borates in our Niban and our Boracare. And then, of course, you have right here the midocloprids. So this is the neonics. All these, this kind of gives you a diagram of where everything is located based on active mode of action. But what they've done now is that they've actually tailored some things to our industry. And one is houseflies. And you can see right here how it allows for you to read about insecticide resistance management. You have future reading. You can look at economic thresholds, sort of gives you information in terms of the different modes of action that you might be able to employ in terms of with regards to your control program. Okay, so these are things that are important. Even as you're a technician or a manager, I strongly recommend that you reference the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee website. All right, go back to get the species correct. right? So you have the species that kind of looks like a humpback fly. Might find in a dining room, what is it? This isn't a humpback fly. This is a fungus gnat, right? So fungus gnats a lot of times are just associated with potted plants. Wet things, so to speak. So they'll feed on fungal growth and organic matter, but they're not really disease carriers. So, you know, it's one of these things where you might be overwintering the plants, it's going to be overwatering the plants, water leaks, things of that nature, that you can work with the pest operator and say, hey, this is not really a food harboring insect. It mostly likes wet organic stuff. Maybe your plants or remove plants, or they're dying, whatever, and then you can solve the issue, okay? Now, there's some other invading species I like to talk about, the blowflies and the flesh flies. They're both sort of organic excrement, sewage, decaying matter, disease-carrying, you know, nasty flies. And they're usually larger than houseflies. The top is a green blowfly, and the bottom species is actual flesh fly. And they breed in all sorts of environments. A lot of times these flies actually come inside from the outside. But once they get established in a certain area, sometimes they're hard to eliminate. And we at Nisus Corporation had a picture contest, and these are some pictures I'm going to show you that pest operators gave to us as far as their worst case scenarios they had to actually work in. But these are some of the pre-level stuff that most operators that I talk to have to deal with. You can look at, you know, decaying food, unclean floors, spilled grease, all of these sort of environments that allow for flies to breed in and so forth, okay? And drains. Drains are probably one of the #1 harboring areas for flies in commercial kitchens. So if you're going to do work in commercial kitchens, you're definitely going to inspect all the drains, I can tell you that. And then right here you might have something where you have, as I said, an agricultural field like myself, and you have all this trash that's not associated with the restaurant, but it allows for flies to sort of eat all of that remaining material and breed, and they come inside from those areas, okay? And the crack and crevice locations as well. Bar mats. These are some of the worst things that I think restaurants ignore. Each bar, should have 2 sets of bar mats. That is that. One they use that day. After that night, they clean it, let it dry, replace it with another one. Sometimes they'll use the same one over and over again, and it allows them to accumulate material, and they're not cleaned well enough, and then that will allow for flies to breed and survive, okay? The bar areas, these are areas where flies potentially will harbor. As I said, they like the sugars of alcohol and the undrained bar wells, beer, residual liquors, things like that they'll feed on. And of course, trash receptacles, right? So sometimes it's not the trash itself, believe it or not, these receptacles will build gunk on the outer, you know, the walls of the receptacles, and that adds as a feeding source. And sometimes flies will lay eggs on that material, and those eggs will sort of embed into the film. Okay, so that can be a source as well. And the recyclables. Recyclables are a good source, particularly for males that really like sugars and so forth, to congregate and consume to build up their energy before the breeding cycle. So focus on those as well. If you see a large recyclable bin, those are areas that sometimes attract flies. And then the outdoor trash bins. That is that the restaurant might not be able to sort of control where this trash bin is. If they can, the farther away from an entrance point, the better. But if you look at this picture right here, you have a bunch of trash and you have a loaf of bread at the bottom. You know, that's a breeding site. That's a food source site, okay? Not ideal. And if that can be changed and be rectified, I strongly recommend to do that. So these are some avenues you can take to help yourself, help the customer, to help you sort of at least eliminate some of the barriers that make the problem a little bit harder to solve. Now, this Nisus picture contest, you might have seen some of these, but these are, as I said, pictures that have been sent to us. Something like this where you have some sort of tool, drill or whatever, and it's encased in nastiness. Who knows how long that's been? That place could have not been cleaned for years. Stuffed drains, right? This is a very problematic situation. That is definitely a source for flies. And of course, you open it up, you've opened up a drain up like this, think of it as something that might need to be physically cleaned first before you do an insecticide treatment or you do a sanitation treatment, so to speak, okay? But that's a source for flies. And standing water, right? Flies do like standing water. A lot of them actually breed in standing water, and sort of the larvae use that as the food source material in the water, and then they'll hop off, and mosquitoes are like that, of course, but other flies can use this as well. So that's pretty nasty, and that's going to harbor a lot of pathogens, I think, as well. Unclean equipment. Just because they clean the floors doesn't mean they necessarily clean the equipment that is cooking the material, all right? And those underneath those fry rigs and ovens and so forth get really ignored, and it can accumulate a lot of mass and a lot of food source for flies. This particular picture is, I think, a great picture to show you how dangerous sometimes places can be. I would probably avoid even doing work in this particular situation like this. You have it seems like an electrical outlet with duct tape over it, and what happens if flies are breeding in there? And you can look at trash can receptacle, it's nasty. I mean, this is really, really a bad area. Extremely unsanitary, and probably you're going to beat yourself over and over again to try to get the pest population down if you don't do a sanitation program with this first, okay? Sometimes you have exposing wires, little areas where matter is so congregated in some areas where it's just so dirty and nasty that it might be prudent to step back and talk to the manager and say, hey, clean it up first before I can do anything for you. And then something like this, where you have a food source. Now this is what I have verified this. This is material that goes into the ice cream machine, vending machines, like buffets and so forth. This is a food source that's exposed. You cannot treat in this area at all with this stuff exposed. Can't do it. So what do? I mean, you can't do anything. The restaurant management has to work with you, so they remove this material, and then you can conduct your service, okay? So keep an eye out for that. Same thing as this. You have rice kernels, tomatoes in a bucket. This is an area where you can't treat as well because there's food exposed, okay? Even if it's going to be trashed, I wouldn't even chance it, because you never know what the restaurant's going to do anyhow. You just cannot conduct a service in a situation like this, all right? And then the spilled grease. Now, obviously they're not going to serve this, but you treating over spilled grease is just not going to work, and that needs to be removed. Now, if you want to higher your price point and you want to do a cleaning service, that's up to you, but they have to have some skin in the game as well. And this is something that obviously is showing they don't have skin in the game at the particular time. So you have to convince them to have skin in the game for you to help them keep their restaurant absent of flies. And then drain. So what I like about this picture is that you have the drain itself is nasty, but also you have a piping that has an opening that's a conduit for flies to go into and travel through the multi-drain system of that potential kitchen or kitchens, and they'll use piping like that as conduits, okay? So not only is the drain nasty, but now you have a conduit for flies to use. And something like this, where this might be just a nasty area where you're even unsure you can treat, I think this is a area where multiple drain lines come together, and it's like a sewage dump of some, not sewage dump, but a compacting dump of some sort. I really don't know. This right here, other rice kernels, so you have like a rice maker. This is food exposed to me, untreatable. Can't treat that area until that's cleaned out. And then of course you have like double drain pipes leading into a drain right here. This is probably from a bar well of some sort, and you can see just it looks like it hasn't been cleaned in years. I mean, I think that's more than a year. It could be variable more than a year. So these are good signs that the management really doesn't take the time to keep their facility sanitary. And I would use this as a baseline to decide if you want to do business, and if you do, to make your price point according to the level of sanitation you have to fight against to get your control methods working. And then this last one right here, you have the salt shaker. Now, I usually when I give this presentation live, I ask you, what's the probability of them reusing that salt shaker? Maybe 40%, who knows? I mean, they're desperate, they might very well. So keep that in mind as well. Control measures. Which one is most important on this list? And you're probably going to hear this over and over again for anybody else that really talks about flies, particularly Harry, who's my colleague, that really the most important one is sanitation. That is, if the sanitation is there, then the pest control that is conducted will be needed, but it won't be in such a stringent amount, in that you don't have to overload to keep the pest population at a minimal level, okay? A lot of restaurants will clean floors and sometimes power wash floors, which is fine, but it depends on, the issue can be is where does that water drain into, and those drains that the water drains into, are they cleaned afterwards too? Hopefully they don't become clogged, because then they can cause issues with pathogens and organic matter festering, and who knows, bacteria growing and so forth like that, and it becomes a breeding site for flies and for roaches. But are these good areas for fly development? Absolutely. Look at that top left one. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Okay, if that's next to a restaurant, I mean, I don't know. The management of that building needs to do something about that. Okay, so if you turn it into something like this, where you make it very clean, it reduces the population so well. I mean, by 30% at least. Okay, so just by sanitizing those trash receptacles, it just reduces the amount of problems significantly. If you're going to mop, and it's common to mop with borates, we recommend that you use DOT, which is our active ingredient in NIBOR-D, because of solubility in water. DOT is soluble in water up to about 15%, and it doesn't corrode metals and so forth, unlike boric acid that is only about soluble up to 3%, and it does corrode, okay? So we recommend mopping with DOT. And then as far as like the other insecticides, now you have the larvae and the adults, but they're different focal points. That is that the adults are mainly just the liquid stuff, that you're focusing on the adults for killing the adults with liquids. Maybe some baits and some metered aerosols if you still use them. But that's not going to solve the issue, because if you don't kill the larva, it's never going to disappear. So you have to really use more of the augmentative management, sanitation management, sort of infused with slight amount of specialized insecticides to get the larva and the breeding sites gone, and then the adults will disappear for the most part, okay? So, if you're going to use insecticides for adults, so you're focusing on direct application, and the larva is more like on the, a selective approach, as I said before. I think that if you divide the two up, that is that if it's divided between adults and larvae, I would say the larva and the breeding sites and all that's about 60, I would say about 70 to 75% of the issue, most likely, and then the adults would be another 25, okay? So keep that in mind, all right? Now, you can do a lot of mechanical and augmentative practices for larvae and eggs and so forth, but it's removing the substrates. It's removing the breeding substrates, and if you have a bioremediation program after your pest control service, or you space it out, that's fine, but removing those breeding sites will eliminate the larva significantly, okay? And of course, when it comes to baits, usually baits are targeting the adults more than anything, and baits are great for the outside. I tend not to recommend fly baits on the inside. It's usually you're using them on the outside to, say, kill them in dumpsters or around those areas. And of course, baits can compete with the natural food source. But that being said, though, There are some selective spray baits you can spray into drains and so forth that are effective. And as I said, those are targeted a lot of times for sometimes adults and larvae, and their use patterns are very, very narrow in terms of where you can apply them. I also recommend using an IGR. I think an insect growth regulator is ideal for flies due to the level of their life cycles and their variations. When you have 7 to 28 days, you can really disrupt the sort of pattern that generations that overlap, the issues that they cause, and so you can have sort of a good effect on the development of future adults and knock back that population, okay? And then we deal with borates. Borates are ideal for insects that groom heavily. And the flies, roaches, and beetles these are groups that really get affected by borates. And you can apply borates as a powder or as a liquid formulation. As I said before, that there is a borate difference with regard to DOT and boric acid. DOT is very water soluble. It's non-corrosive to metals and things like that. Unlike boric acid that can corrode metal pipes, and the solubility of boric acid in water is about 3.5%. So it's do the test yourself. Mix DOT, mix a pound of DOT in a gallon of water, and do that with boric acid and see what happens. Okay, you'll see the difference yourself. So we strongly recommend use DOT when you're using borates. And then if you think about the augmentation, other mechanical methods, the cleaning drains, which I think is the most important thing. That here's a simple drain structure. You sort of have this P-trap that sort of lowers and raises based on the use of the drain, and flies will go through that trap and they'll transverse from the pipes. Roaches do as well, by the way. But what happens when you're working with a restaurant? It's not just one drain. You have multiple drains going into other multiple drains, and then you might have some larger drains going into smaller drains and going into a grease trap. So it's a conduit, it's a system. And you have all these conduits that are coming into play with regards to breeding sites and potential harboring areas and things of that nature. So you're working with a greater system than you are just, say, a one particular sink drain in a residential house. It's important because many times you might have to clean these drains out first. So you think about that. How many drains does, say, an Applebee's restaurant have as compared to, say, the Bellagio in Las Vegas? All right, so it gets cumbersome after a while. And sometimes drains need to be sort of sanitized and cleaned prior. Whether you add that to your service or not is up to you, but that would definitely change your price point with regards to your service, okay? And there are a lot of drain cleaning products out there that will be compromised by bleach and disinfectants and so forth, okay? But I think that when you're cleaning drains, the first thing is to actually spider wire them and get them really clean of all that nasty debris. And then you can use these products as a sort of maintenance program to keep the drains from like organic matter and oils and fats and so forth from building on the inner piping, okay? And that you can use in terms of our product line, NIBOR-D and DSV can be used in conjunction with each other to not only sort of kill everything there, but also disinfect as well. So DSV is a disinfectant, and it will kill the bacteria and certain viruses that reside in drains as well. So it's a double fist punch, so to speak. Now, light traps. I am a fan of light traps. I think light traps still have a very strong use in our industry, and these are sort of the variables of how you would use light traps. Now, I don't necessarily. I've been out of the. I don't know what their technology is as much as I used to, but generally speaking, I think they work very well. And they have to sort of compete with sunlight, as we well know. But you want to also keep them away from critical areas, okay? So you don't put a light trap right above a food prep area, because the flies are going to go to the light trap and then they're going to boom right to the food area. So you kind of want to space them out to where they're sort of there's one big sort of theme around the kitchen or wherever you're trying to protect, but you don't draw them to particular draw them into sensitive areas, okay? And there are also special light traps that you can put out in the dining room areas, but usually I recommend that you kind of avoid that and just use light traps in the problem areas around the kitchen and entranceways, okay? So what's the size of the area needed for protection? So generally speaking, fly lights cover around 35 feet, between 30 and 35 feet, and I'll show you a diagram in a minute here, but you're trying to intercept them before they actually enter any critical areas, all right? And so this picture right here, it's like, well, they enter, and maybe you have a light trap right by the door, right by a dumpster, so they just sort of go to that immediately instead of coming in to more of the interior of the kitchen to find a good harborage area or a potential food source. But the distance is around 25 to 30 feet, so you're not going to always capture everything. The response is always varied, and it all depends on the individual and the species that you're trying to work against with fly lights. But you form a series of chain lights. That's the ideal thing to do, to where as the fly maneuvers in the kitchen, it's always going to hit some sort of wavelength. And by spacing them out 25, 30, or 20 feet apart, you should be able to successfully actually conduct that. And so this is just sort of a diagram of where you might want to place some of the lights. You might want to have one, a couple in the kitchen, one or two in the front establishment, maybe, then larger ones, near the access to the outside. So where you're killing majority of them come outside, and the ones that sort of avoid that will slowly migrate to other areas, and you have more sensitive lights for whatever reason based on the lighting in the kitchen area. So they all have different wavelengths that you can tweak and so forth to the actual lighting in the establishment. But usually flies they don't fly in high heights. That is, I think the average is like 5 to 8 feet that you would actually place a light. Some flies actually like to go low, but generally about 5 feet or so is the general sort of idea of where you want to mount certain traps, light traps and whatnot. And of course, you don't want them to compete against sunlight. That sunlight's always going to win, and the wavelength of the sunlight's going to bleed out what that fly light does. So to make sure that you don't compete with sunlights and so forth like that. So, don't compete with sun. Now, exclusion, doors and windows. This is something that you can add on to your service. I find exclusion that works fairly well. The thing about exclusion is that sometimes it's just using a simple door curtain, or closing windows of that nature. That is that you might actually have a hinged door that automatically closes. That can help sometimes dramatically in terms of preventing the access of flies into a particular establishment. Or maybe screen doors, that matter. There are variations on the theme that you can look at. Door curtains are popular. I find door curtains probably, they reduce the amount of pests that come in because it is a barrier, okay? I like the air curtains. I think that air curtains are a good way to prevent flies from coming in by push them out and so forth, and it just sort of prevents them from sort of getting in that barrier. And a lot of times when I think restaurants sometimes are afraid to put them up because they think that if they have an air curtain, it indicates that they've had a fly problem. I don't see it that way. I see it as an indication that they're initiating the step to prevent the fly problem from occurring. That's how I see how air curtains can be used, okay? So last but not least, the Nisus program. We at Nisus Corporation, we stand by our program, we stand by our products when it comes to fly control. I can't begin to tell you how well borates work, how well DOT works. Disodium octaborate tetrahydrate, which is our active ingredient in NIBOR-D, how well that works against flies. If you use our product line, we guarantee it's going to work, okay? Bottom line. We have these, we also have reference cards that you can use that sort of give you a guideline of how to use our product line, particularly for foaming drains of that nature. And as I said before, drains will probably be one of the highlighted areas that you would want to treat always. okay, one of the mandatory areas. And it's just a guideline. We recommend that you at least do a 5% solution, but I'd say we start at 10% solution with NIBOR-D and then work your way down. 5% being maybe you want to maintain, 10% kill the pest population immediately or quick as you can. You can go as high as 15 if you need to do that. That's fine too. But here's on our drain cards on the back side or the front side, whatever side you're looking at, you can gives you a sort of a timeline based on your first visit, second visit, third visit of what you want to treat and where to treat and so forth like that. I get questions. Well, Reed, how do I incorporate like Bacazap and other of these microbial draining products if I'm using stuff that's caustic to them? And I say, well, you can space it out. Once you get the maintenance side of things done, then you can probably end up doing those once a month. But most importantly, really, is the NIBOR-D and the DSV. That once you get that pest population to a minimum, then maybe you can go in there once a quarter and do a full sort of biosanitation, bioremediation service once a quarter, so to speak, or maybe once every 6 months. The main thing is that the concentration of the actual insect itself at first, okay? And NIBOR-D comes in obviously different container sizes, but it can be mopped. You can also spray it as a dust in cracks and crevices, and it's very soluble in water, as I said. Mix it with the DSV. You can also use other insecticides with DSV too. If you want to use bifenthrin or whatever, deltamethrin, you can mix DSV and NIBOR-D with those products as well. So you can have like a 3-level concoction to hammer out the fly problem, okay? Just after you're spraying the drains, make sure that make sure there's other insecticides are labeled for drains. And then Bacazap you can use for odor elimination as well. The thing about fly control, as I said before, is that it's a continual process. That think about it as, even if you get the pest population down to a minimum, you have to keep it there, all right? And then if you say you walk away from that restaurant, trust me, it's going to crop back up. So that's something you have to talk with the manager about. And usually they're understanding about this, but it's not something that it disappears and it goes away forever. It's not. The pest population will return, okay? And these are just some ideas of where you can apply Bacazap, and we do have a good foaming agent if you want to foam with our product line. But the dumpsters, the garbage cans, all these areas, this is where you need to focus on as well, not just the drains, but the outside areas as well. Okay, and you can use everything in combination how you wish. The best thing is that don't forget about the cracks and crevices, that you can foam underneath certain areas and let that foam sort of reside, and then it will just sort of dissipate, and it will leave the NIBOR-D and whatever else you're using as a sort of a residual in the small little cracks. So to conclude, you can't control flies with just insecticides alone. You have to incorporate a sanitation and sort of a maintenance program where you're just slowly but surely making sure that things are clean and that there's no sort of excessive debris in certain areas. And the cleanest surroundings, the fewer chances there are for flies to breed. All right, so that's it. Thank you for listening. Next time.